my lord, ladies and gentlemen. Harbinder described me as retired. I think if I may rephrase it, I say I'm not paid for anything I do nowadays. I certainly don't feel as if I'm retired. It's a huge pleasure to welcome all of you here today, the 119th anniversary of the Battle of Satagahi, a battle which has been described, I think quite rightly, as the greatest last stand of them all, a remarkable occasion in every sense. And it's also an enormous honour as well as a pleasure to welcome here our speaker, Ambassador Singh, who over a 34-year career in the Indian diplomatic service, which included tours as ambassador in the UAE and in Iran, but many other senior postings in Delhi and beyond, which together have given him an extraordinary insight and authority to speak to us on this subject tonight. If, like me, you were brought up on tales of daring do in the northwest frontier, and if you were introduced by your father, and my father had served in the Indian Army during the war, you were at an early age brought up on books like Peter Hopkirk's The Great Game, then those very words, the great game, immediately summon up an image, a theatre really, on which there have been and still are enormous strategic themes being played out, and also at the same time, at the other end of the scale, enormous stories of human interest. Now, the Sikhs themselves have played no small part in the great game in one way or another, not just as warriors, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that quite rightly tonight, but also as traders. And I was talking to my son, who, as Harbinder implied, is married to a Sikh girl, this morning, and he was reminding me that when he was in Afghanistan during the rule of the Taliban, he came across a Sikh community in Ghazni, which had been there for over 100 years, trading peacefully, harmoniously with the local population, which Sikhs, as well as having a fine martial reputation, have always managed to coexist and trade peacefully and harmoniously with communities in various places. They are indeed remarkable people in that way. So we are looking forward enormously to what you've got to say, and having had a few minutes conversation with you earlier, I'm even more excited by what it might be. The Ambassador has very kindly agreed to take questions at the end, so if we could wait until then, please, unless there's something absolutely burning which you've got to ask. And otherwise, I would just ask you to join me in thanking him very much for coming over here to talk to us on this occasion. Thank you, sir.
Lord Inderjeet Singh, a great honor that you're here and a pleasure to meet you. Field Marshal, likewise. General Curry, thank you very much for your kind words, ladies and gentlemen. This talk came about by a sheer accident, I would say, because I was walking out of a bookshop in Khan Market in Delhi when I bumped into Harvinderji, who was walking past, and television, the idiot box that it is, does have some virtues, because he saw me and he said, "I've seen you on the television," and we got talking. And then he thereafter approached me and he said, "We have the Saragadi Day, and would you be able to come and speak?" And for me, it was a particularly a great honor, because my maternal grandfather also got an Indian Order of Merit fighting the Afghans around then, not 1897, probably a couple of years before it. And then he went on to retire after First World War, becoming a Sardar Bahadur and greatly honored, and spent a few months here at Buckingham Palace as a junior ADC because of all the honors he had earned. But really the very first one was on the Western Front, right there, just about the time of the battle. And I've just promised him, because they are doing a book on the Indian Order of Merit, to send them a photograph of his wearing that honor. So for me, it had that link. And then when I started reading up on it, it dawned on me that it's not really a standalone battle. It's not just a battle of those 21 people serving a colonial master. There's a context to it. There's always a context to historical events. And that's what I intend doing today, giving you the larger context and linking it to what is happening today, linking it to what the British troops were doing till about 4 years ago with the ISAF, and what the US troops are still doing in line of fire in Afghanistan. The problem is the Pashtun issue and the contestation over this rather under-endowed land, which doesn't grow much, but which is at a junction of Central Asia, Iran, and India, and becomes very important as a junction point and has been for centuries. The battle, if we start just with the battle, came 4 years after the Durand Line was settled. And when I was walking up, I found that there is a foundation stone somewhere as you walk up the steps, which also says 1893. That's when the Durand Line was drawn. Now, the Durand Line is along the foothills below Khyber, running along a line there. But when you go back and you say the Pashtuns have been either both a buffer for India as well as a part of the problem, because the invasions that came from Central Asia, the Turco-Uzbek tribes that filtered down, if they took a right turn, they went through Iran and in the 13th century overthrew the Caliph and ransacked Baghdad. But if they took a left turn, then they were in India. So the Pashtuns first would stop them and then they would join them. And very often they were on both sides of the battle later. So we find that the Pashtun problem really, we have told nowadays in India, when we talk about Afghanistan, traditional friendship between the Afghan people and India, well, that's a post-freedom struggle development. But the friendship doesn't go all that far back, because you find that the Pashtun has been, for the first time they ruled India as part of the Lodi dynasty, which was an Afghan dynasty, pre-Mughal. Then, of course, once the Mughals come in, Mughals were not Pashtuns, but Mughals first conquered Kabul. They were in Kabul. And then from there, Babur comes into India. And then, of course, the Mughals were the first ones who developed a frontier policy. Because for them, the same Afghans now became a problem. Because if you are an emperor in Delhi, you have to safeguard your western frontier, because they knew that is where the invasions come from. And so the frontier policy, the first really cogent frontier policy, you find Akbar adopted, because Akbar looked at Kabul, Kandahar as the frontier axis. He did not look at the foothills because they had ruled in Kabul. So for them, Kabul and Kandahar were the two ends of an axis, which was critical to defending India. Because if you allowed an intruder to come past it, then he will just spill over Indus, and he was in the heartland of Punjab, and then he would just march to Delhi. So this was the first frontier, first forward defense. The British were not doing a forward defense. They were not the first to do a forward defense. The first forward defense was by Akbar. And they were not always able to control both ends of that, because the Persians always viewed Kandahar as part of their zone of influence. And in fact, the Achaemenid Empire, back in the 7th century BC, treated Indus as their eastern frontier. So this area was always contested. The Persians have always seen this part as their eastern frontier up to Indus. So Kandahar was very much a part of their legacy. And so whoever ruled from Esfahan, he always had his eyes on Kandahar. So at times the Mughals lost it, then they got it back. But essentially that was the axis that he was looking at. But as the Mughals got weak after the death of Aurangzeb, that's when then again the intrusions take place. First Nader Shah, the ruler of Iran, he attacks, ransacks the treasury in Delhi. And today, if you go to Tehran and you go to the basement where the jewels are kept, many of them have no provenance. They don't say where they've come from. Some were bought by the Shah, but there are a huge amount of rubies and diamonds, which are all very clearly from the Mughal treasury. Because till the beginning of the 19th century, Golconda mines were the only mines in the world producing diamonds. And so it's not a mistaken thing that we hear about India being as a sparrow of jewels, because India was the only country producing diamonds till the end of the 18th century. So the Mughal emperor had a huge collection of these diamonds, and the Kohinoor went from there. It traveled up, Nader Shah took it. And then from Nader Shah, his Afghan general, when he is assassinated, Abdali takes it. And Abdali is the one who was a scourge. Now, this is when he was an Afghan scourge for the Indians. He made a dozen odd invasions on India, mostly to pillage and loot, not to hold territory, and 3 or 4 into Punjab. And that was the Pashtun problem that the Punjab was facing at that stage. He came and despoiled, in fact, the Golden Temple, cut the carcasses of cows and threw them in the temple tanks. And it's when he passes on and he dies away and a vacuum is created, from that rose the Sikh missiles and the Sikh kingdom was formed under Ranjit Singh in 1801. And in fact, it is said that he was the first indigenous ruler of the Punjab in almost 1,000 years. All others were not indigenous rulers, because this was contested territory between Turco-Uzbeks, Afghans, Persians. All kinds of invaders passed through this territory on their way to Delhi. But Ranjit Singh was the first indigenous ruler. And he then develops a frontier policy to deal with the Pashtuns. And that line which he had, the forts at the base, some of them made by the Mughals, the fort at Attock, Trans-Indus, controlling the Trans-Indus areas, is almost the salient of the Durand Line, which was drawn up in 1893, because the Sikh kingdom is overthrown, then the British annex it, and it becomes a British problem. And the British problem is what the Anglo-Afghan wars were about, some leading to extremely tragic circumstances where only one doctor survived and came back from a whole army that went in. So the British also realized that for a non-Muslim to control the Pashtuns, you can't have a forward policy. They will eject you. If you go into Kabul, you'll get ejected. So you have basically at best, you control them at the Durand Line, which means the settled areas, and then you have the highlands, a bit like what you have here, Scotland, the lowlands and the highlands. And it's interesting what various British writers of that period have to say about the Pashtun character, which is, I think, important when we discuss this. We'll just get back to the 19th century. You have many British administrators in the forward areas who've written about the Pashtun character. In 1851, Herbert Edwards has this to say, and this he had to say about the Waziri tribe. He said that they have strong clan identity, codes of honor, which make them prey to the ulema, or those learned in the ways of Islam. He says on the one side, they're very proud people, but they are incredibly credulous as far as the ulema is concerned or the religious man is concerned. Whatever he comes and tells them, particularly if he traces his descent from the Prophet and he says he's a sheikh, their language is not Arabic. They don't understand really what's in the Quran. It's by rote they know it, but somehow they take to it very, very quickly. And it's a coincidence or otherwise that that Islam has spread from Arabia, which is again barren, very Spartan, and it finds the most resonance again in an area which is tribal and where the living is very Spartan, where nature has not bestowed them with anything much. But when the two combine, when their tribal Pakhtunwali, their tribal code combines with this religious fervor, then you get nuclear fission, and that is where they become lethal. And that is where the Battle of Saragadi is linked to what is happening today, because the problem is still there. So the problem continues in a series of ways I'll just describe to you. That very often we think that Wahhabi Islam and militancy has come to the AFPAC area only with 2001 or with the Soviet incursion. But that's a very recent development. But actually what happened is when the Mughals are overthrown, then the Muslim community in India, and this is a fascinating book written by Charles Allen, it's called God's Terrorists. And it is the most defining book on this whole. He traces it from the beginning. And he says that wherever the Muslim community faces adversity or has a setback, then they tend to revert back to a very Spartan, very basic version of Islam, which is very hard and very non-inclusive. And it starts really in the 13th century. Middle of the 13th century, the Mongols sack Baghdad, the caliph is killed, and about then is born a person called Ibn Taymiyyah, who develops, Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah, is born in Syria, where we are seeing now the current problem, in 1263. And Ibn Taymiyyah is the father of what later becomes Wahhabism, which is a very Spartan understanding, literalist reading of the Quran, and a very Spartan reversion back to what you say was done during the Prophet's time. No ijtihad, no debate or discussion. 8th century, the Caliph at that point, Caliph Mamun, in fact allowed, because when Islam spreads, it comes across Greek thought, Greek philosophy. So Caliph Mamun is the first one who starts allowing reasoning. He would call a Christian priest and he would call a Muslim priest and ask them to debate in his court religious principles based on philosophy and theology. And this went on only for about 20 years and a couple of imams after that. And then it is turned back. Then they said there will be no more discussion, because they said between reason and revelation, there cannot be a discussion. If Quran is the God's word, it's revealed, then it is not subject to interpretation through logic and philosophy. And that is the dominant thought, which continued all through, and was again how it comes to India, because when the Mughals are overthrown, at the end of the 18th century, where Wahhabism starts in Saudi Arabia, and the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah from the 13th century finds lodging in Saudi Arabia, is Al-Wahhab. And Al-Wahhab and an Indian religious ulema called Wahilullah were together studying in Medina at the end of the 18th century. And Waliullah comes to Delhi and starts a madrasa. Al-Wahhab does an alliance with the Al-Saud family, which continues till now. Though the Al-Sauds he did an alliance with, they were captured by an Egyptian army and the Ottomans killed them. But nevertheless, the alliance between the Wahhabis and the Al-Saud ruling family dates from that period. And in India, the thought was brought by Wahilullah and his follower, his student there by the name of Said Ahmed, who was from Patna in Bihar. He takes it, he starts preaching it all over North India, but he didn't find any support because most of the clergy was inclusive and moderate. And they said, this guy, what he's saying is not acceptable. So from Patna, what he does is, during the time that you had a Sikh kingdom in Punjab, they go again to Buner, go to the Pashtun area, because that is where they are welcomed. In India, they were not welcome. So they bypass the Sikh kingdom, go through Sindh, reach Buner, but because he was a Said, he traced his descent from the Prophet. So he was immediately accepted as the religious leader, and he was given the same honor and the same title which Mullah Omar had later, which is the commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen. So he's declared an Amir al-Mu'mineen, just as Mullah Omar, taking the Prophet's chadar in the 1990s, declared himself as Amir al-Mu'mineen, as the leader of the Taliban. So this is not a new thing. This is what has been going on in that area continuously with gaps. And it is a Sikh army, and therefore what he does is, he issues a fatwa in the year that's why I always speak from memory rather than notes, but I was so overawed coming here, I said, let me put it down on a piece of paper. Anyway, he issues a fatwa in about 1830 in which he says, holy war against the Sikhs. A Sikh army then pursues him, catches up with him, and finishes off that. Mullah Omar was never caught by the ISF. Mullah Omar died a natural death. In fact, Pakistan kept telling a lie for a couple of years that he was still alive, till it was discovered he was no longer alive. They were just functioning in his name. They only caught up with Osama. But the Sikh army caught up with Sheikh Said and butchered him and threw all his parts into the river, because they said if there is a grave, then they'll become a rallying point. So there was peace till about 1840s, till the Sikh kingdom is there. But then you have an uprising in India, 1857. Again, all these forces which were below the surface, they tied up. It was a nationalistic upsurge. It's called the mutiny. In your books, we call it the First War of Independence. So various forces arose including forces which belonged to radical Islam, which were lying low. They certainly emerged because they realized that we can probably again get Muslim rule back in India. And when that did not happen, frustration sets in again, because you can't get that. And therefore, this continued in that area. You had Viceroy Mayo was assassinated by a Pathan. He had gone to Andamans and he's boarding a boat, and somebody lunges at him with a knife. A viceroy was assassinated. So this stream has continued, and the very creation of Pakistan is from this stream to say that the Muslim has to rule. Now, if the Muslim has to rule and you're going to have democracy after the British leave, then they cannot rule India, because their population at the height of the Mughal Empire was never more than 20% of India's population. So then you have to have a Muslim majority area. So they got a Muslim majority area. Now, having got a Muslim majority area, they also inherited the Pashtun problem. So now the Pashtun problem, which was a Mughal problem, a Sikh problem, a British problem, became a Pakistan problem. So they decided to deal with it their way. So that is where the friendship in modern times is there between an Afghan government and the Indian government, because now enemy is your friend. So they did not accept the Durand Line. In fact, the ruler of Afghanistan, the minute the Durand Line was agreed upon and drawn, he wrote a letter to the viceroy saying, "You're cutting me off from my tribesmen on the other side. You're insulting me in the face of my own tribesmen. I do not accept this line." Because even today, you have 30 million Pashtuns on the Pakistan side, and you only have about 13 or 14 million in Afghanistan. But the interesting thing is, but if you ask an Afghan Pashtun that would you separate from Afghanistan and combine with these, they get very upset. They said, no, Afghanistan is ours, even though their population may be less than 50%. They said, we do not want a partitioning of Afghanistan. They're very, very, because basically Abdali, the creator of Ahmad Shah Durrani, the creator of modern Afghanistan, for them, the rule is out of Kandahar, but you rule over the whole of Afghanistan. But the problem then becomes a further geopolitical problem when the Soviets walk into Afghanistan in 1979. There are three things that happen in 1979 which cause the problem, the consequences of which we are still facing today. You have an Islamic revolution in Iran in January, February. Imam Khomeini returns to Iran. Shah is jettisoned. The Western alliance, the twin pillar policy of Nixon, it comes apart because the Souths are left, but you have an Islamic regime in Tehran. And end of the year, the Soviets walk into Kabul. And a month before that, in November, a self-proclaimed Mahdi in Saudi Arabia, his people forcibly occupy the Makkah Masjid. Now the Saudis had to call in the French paratroopers, and only then they were able to eject them. But the net result of that was that the Saudi ruling family realized that they had to now just throw up their hands and allow the Wahhabis to do exactly what they wanted in terms of export of their version of Islam, because otherwise questions will be asked about their legitimacy of running that country. So the alliance, which was 200 years old between the Wahhabis and the Al Saud family, it startled the family so much that at that stage they became active promoters to direct all their attention outwards rather than inwards, so that no questions are asked. And these three forces create, in 1979, Zia-ul Haq in the meanwhile, the military dictator of Pakistan, had hanged Bhutto. Neither Saudi Arabia nor UAE were talking to him because both ruling families had told him not to do it. And the West were upset with him. But once the Soviets walk in, he becomes the most desired man. And that is where he creates a union between Saudi funds, Saudi Wahhabism, American intelligence and arms, and Zia-ul Haq's own Islamist tendencies. And you create the forces which then become Taliban, which then become jihad, which then become terrorists, which now continue in that area. So instead of now Pakistan having a forward policy to simply safeguard themselves, they started looking at Afghanistan as giving them strategic depth. So it became an area where they said, India will have zero influence, and we want strategic depth by controlling them. But control them they couldn't, because an Afghan, as the saying goes, you can rent an Afghan, but you can't buy him. So you can have an alliance with him. So they discovered that when 9/11 took place, they sent emissaries to Mullah Omar, and a former ambassador, former Pakistan High Commissioner to Delhi was telling me, who was then their ambassador in Kabul, that they went to see Mullah Omar, and you had Saudi intelligence chief, you had top emissaries from Pakistan saying, please hand over the Taliban, hand over Osama bin Laden and the people who have done this, and it'll be over. But Mullah Omar wouldn't do it, because there the Pakhtunwali, the Afghan code of honor comes in, and they tried their best, but they realized that as long as you have an alliance where you agree with them, it's all right. But where you have a strategic difference, they're not going to do what you ask them to do. These are the Afghans. They run their own policy. And we have seen the consequence of that is that Pakistan has continued to try to have influence using proxies in Afghanistan. That has not worked. And it's reached a stage where US is now tired of it. There are two signals which have come out in the last 2-3 months, which for India are very significant. Because from 2001 onwards, Americans made sure, and they told us, that you can come into Afghanistan, give them all the economic assistance you want, you can do all the projects you want, but no security links, because that was a precondition that Pakistan had imposed. Now with the killing of Mullah Mansoor, the successor to Mullah Omar, because US is not dependent on Pakistan any longer to use the corridor through Pakistan to supply the small number of troops they have there, and nor are the Pakistanis able or willing, we don't know whether it's inability or unwillingness to bring Taliban to the negotiating table. But interesting thing is that Mullah Mansoor, the leader of Taliban, who it was believed is very close to Pakistan, was actually crossing back from Iran. He crossed back from Iran at the border. He was being monitored by US, got into a car. He was carrying a Pakistani passport under a fake name. And when he was killed by a drone, he was passing through Baluchistan on his way back from Iran. Now that raises many possibilities. That Taliban are also looking differently at Iran. Iran may be looking differently at Taliban, because Iran's preoccupation is now with West Asia, with Syria, and they have a common enemy in the way of ISIS or Daesh, because neither the Taliban nor the Iranians would want Daesh to be replanted in Afghanistan, though some of the local commanders at the Taliban level are committing their loyalty to the commander of ISIS. So this has become a new thing. Nor does Pakistan want it, because you cannot control ISIS. Whereas you want assets like the Haqqanis, whom you can control in a geopolitical game you want to play. So now, therefore, that's why I call this the yet new great game. The next new great game has begun. And that next new great game is India and largely US on one side, because the 3-star US general in Afghanistan has been to India a couple of months ago and has publicly asked India to give military help to Afghanistan. Now this was one signal to Pakistan that they are shifting, and the second was the killing of Mullah Mansoor. So you can see a strategic shift by US. Pakistan has got China in their corner. Russia and Iran I just told you, and the Russians are also watching. They are not taking sides. They are just watching at the moment to see which way it goes. They are concerned about this spinning out of control, because the impact now, particularly now when the Uzbek leader has died, they then are worried about radical Islam traveling up, because they have a problem in Chechnya, etc. So they don't want radical Islam to spill out of Afghanistan. So it's begun another new game. Now, new game can have multiple consequences and multiple results. Pakistan realizes that this is a game which has been going on from Mughal times, and you can't control Afghanistan. You can only adjust your interests vis-a-vis the other neighbors. So all neighbors can adjust their interests and say this is not a zero-sum game. After all, it is not for Pakistan to decide whether some other country will be there or not. It's for Afghans to decide. And therefore, it would be useful for them to really bring everyone to the table and come to the table. Again, coincidentally, a little after the killing of Mullah Mansoor, 2 Pakistani army helicopter pilots were taken hostage by one group of the Taliban, and they wanted them to release Mullah Baradar. It's one of the Quetta Shura members whom Pakistan has not permitted to travel back because he was not towing their line. So he's been missing for a long time, obviously under arrest. Now the fact that Taliban can take hostage Pakistani military helicopter pilots is again a signal to Pakistan that Afghans are a very independent lot. They will, if you interfere beyond a point, I think they have hedged now. They are dealing with Iran, they are dealing with other people. It's not the same Taliban which you had in the pre-2001. So they have also learned from the old experience. But the one common feature is that they will eject any foreign interference beyond a point. Then they become your enemy. Now, within this new game, have various countries in the neighborhood learnt a lesson or not learnt a lesson of what has happened over the last 300 years? So the 21 soldiers about whom we have gathered here to talk today were not fighting a battle in a vacuum. They were fighting a battle against a Pashtun uprising which was wedded to, at that stage, still wedded to a radical Wahhabi policy of incitement by the ulema, combined with their own Pashtun traditions, and therefore ready to raise the voice of jihad against what they perceived as an intruder. And they were therefore part of what went on before and part of what has followed. And for us, it's a very important symbol because their sacrifice was not in vain. Their sacrifice was to protect the frontiers of India, a battle that, as I have narrated, has gone on over centuries with positive and indifferent results, depending on who was in Delhi and how much power was there. But the final conclusion is that when you have a powerful ruler, either in Delhi, controlling the whole area, or in the Punjab, or now in Islamabad, then you're able to safeguard your border and you're able to manage some kind of peace on the border. But when you do not have that, when there is a power vacuum, which we are noticing in Pakistan today, when you have military and civilian authority not on the same page, when you don't know what their strategic objectives are, and they try playing a game which they cannot handle, then you will have this spin out of control and you'll have another uprising. It may not be Saragadi, it'll have another name. There'll be soldiers of another name or another religion or another nationality. But the net result will be that you're not going to have stability there. To have stability, we have to wean Afghanistan away from its old days, old ways of drugs, of arms, of fighting. You have to bring them back because geological surveys have shown that they have minerals and metals there. The Chinese went in to bring copper out, but they've walked out. They've just kept their thing there. It's just not possible to do it. We are wanting a connection over land. The president of Afghanistan, who's about to visit India, he has threatened Pakistan. He says, if you do not allow transit to India, because Pakistan does not allow India transit for its trade with Afghanistan and Central Asia. That's why we've gone to Chabahar to create a transit route through Iran. But President of Afghanistan has threatened them that if you don't do it, I'll stop your trade going through Afghanistan to Central Asia. So you find suddenly President Ghani, who was very positive on Pakistan when he took over, in fact, he went to the army chief's office. It's unheard of that the president of a neighboring country visits another country and goes to the army chief's office. He went to the army chief of staff's office to be briefed. But that was to send a signal and to reassure Pakistan that the Afghans were not in anybody's corner and wanted peace and stability. But he has faced frustration over the last many months. He realizes that the Taliban and the Haqqanis continue to commit acts of terror in Afghanistan. And I think US have progressively come onto the same page. And that is where it is resting today. So as we commemorate Saragadi, I think it's both a time to remember their sacrifice as well as to bring out all the tales of caution that emerge from here, from which various countries need to learn a lesson. Thank you.